The first thing Warrant Officer Dara Voss noticed about the man was that he didn't sweat. It was August in Bakersfield, 104 degrees with no shade anywhere near the checkpoint, and every living thing in the San Joaquin Valley was leaking. The truckers were soaked through. The state troopers had pit stains to their belts. Even the dogs panted with their whole bodies. But the man standing at the back of the line outside the relocation processing tent, the one with the close-cropped hair and the jawline like poured concrete, stood perfectly still and perfectly dry, watching everything with eyes that didn't blink enough. Voss had been doing refugee intake for 3 years. You learned to read the ones who were hiding something. She keyed her radio. I've got a possible irregular at gate 4. Tall male, civilian clothes, no visible ID lanyard. Standing back from the queue, copy that. Visual on him? I'm looking right at him. She paused. He's looking right back. The newcomers had arrived 18 months ago, 230,000 of them, give or take, packed into a vessel the size of downtown Sacramento that had come down hard in the Nevada flats, subsonic boom rattling windows from Reno to Vegas. They called themselves Tanktonese in their own tongue. The UN processing teams called them newcomers. The men who'd spray-painted alien scum across the walls of the Fresno Processing Center called them other things. Most of them were thin. Most of them had the look of people who had been afraid for a very long time and had only recently allowed themselves to stop showing it. They came through the intake lines with their heads slightly lowered, their children tucked against their sides, their spotted scalps and wide, dark eyes, and four-fingered hands folded in front of them like they were perpetually apologizing for existing. They answered every question twice, carefully, like each answer was something that could be used against them. Voss had learned a few words of Tanktonese. She used them at the gate sometimes, just to watch the fear come off a face like a coat being shrugged loose. It cost her nothing, and it meant everything to them, and she had decided, somewhere around the end of her first month, that this was the work she was supposed to be doing. The man at the back of the line was Tanktonese. She could see that much now, the faint spotting across his temples, the slight difference in the orbital structure around his eyes. But he moved like no newcomer she'd ever processed. He moved like someone who'd never been afraid in his life. She was still watching him when he disappeared. Not slowly, not with any warning, just there and then gone. The space where he'd been standing, holding nothing but heat, shimmer, and dust. Voss stood very still for a moment. Then she got on the radio again. Detective Sergeant Mara Halstead had been with the Refugee Integration Task Force for 14 months, which was long enough to know that the alien conspiracy theories were mostly garbage and short enough that they still surprised her sometimes. She was sitting in the parking structure of the Kern County Newcomer Integration Center when her partner, a Tanktonese detective named Solan Freck, came back from the vending machine with 2 bottles of water and the expression he wore when he was deciding whether to say something. "The water's cold," he said, handing her one. "Thanks. Also, I spoke with the night supervisor. He confirmed that 2 of the night security staff were reassigned without explanation last week. Both Tanktonese." Halstead unscrewed her bottle. "That is the relevant question." She looked at him. Solon had been a junior logistics officer before the landing, not a slave, technically, though that distinction apparently depended on who you asked. He was careful and precise and rarely said anything he hadn't already turned over 6 times. She'd learned to listen when he spoke, because when he did, it usually meant he'd been sitting on something for a while. "You think they were taken," she said. "I think the pattern is consistent with that." He turned the water bottle in his hands. "There have been 11 similar disappearances in the last 3 weeks, all Tanktonese, all from facilities with reduced human security presence, no bodies, no signs of violence. They are simply gone, like they left voluntarily, or were convinced to." He looked out through the concrete pillar toward the haze of the valley below. "Mara, when we were on the ship, before the crash, there were people whose job it was to manage the population, to keep order, to ensure compliance." He paused. "They were very good at appearing trustworthy." Halstead set down her water. "You think an overseer is here?" Solon said nothing, which was his way of saying yes. The man's name, the name he was using, was Heston Cray. He'd introduced himself to the Francisco family 6 days ago as a former agricultural worker from the Reno settlement, newly arrived in the valley, looking for work. He knew their names, knew their history, knew which neighbor's dog barked at night, and which side of the house got afternoon shade. He had done his homework. The newcomers called the mother Saria. Her human paperwork, said Susan. She was a nurse at the Integration Center's clinic, and she had the kind of steadiness that came from having been through the worst already, from having looked into the empty space where hope used to be, and having decided to fill it herself. Her daughter, they called her Mila at home. Her intake ID, said Emma, was 14, still in the process of learning to be 14 in a world that was itself still in the process of deciding what to do with her. They were kind to him. That was the thing he had not expected. Not kind the way you are kind to a guest, with pleasantness and carefully maintained distance. Kind the way you are kind to someone who has been lost and is trying to find their way back. Saria put food in front of him without asking if he was hungry, because she could see that he was, and she didn't make him feel the weight of the gesture. The daughter taught him slang and laughed when he used it wrong. The neighbors came over 2 nights running. Other Tanktonese, human families from further down the road, and they sat in the kitchen with the windows open and the fan going, and they talked and argued and laughed and ate, and the whole thing felt so profoundly alien to him that it took him 4 days to identify what he was actually witnessing. These people were free. Not free in the technical sense. He understood their legal status well enough. The humans had given them temporary residency, conditional on about 17 layers of bureaucratic requirements, and there was a faction in the national legislature actively trying to deport them back to a vessel that no longer existed. By every measurable standard, their position was precarious. But they laughed without checking over their shoulders first. They argued with each other and went to bed friends. They made decisions, small ones, enormous ones, without asking permission from anyone. The daughter stayed up too late watching something on her phone, and her mother came downstairs at midnight and told her to go to sleep. And the girl said 1 more minute with perfect confidence that she was not going to be punished for it. And that confidence, that small, careless, breathtaking confidence, lodged in him somewhere between the ribs and would not dislodge. He was still thinking about it on the morning he put the pathogen in the water supply. It moved fast the way engineered things do. By nightfall, Saria was running a fever. By the next morning, Emma was worse. Her breathing labored, the characteristic mottling spreading across her temples that meant the virus had found its target. 3 blocks away, an elderly newcomer named Vest Olan, who'd been a school teacher on the ship, died quietly in his apartment before his daughter could get there. Halstead got the call at 4 in the morning. She was at the Integration Center's medical wing by 5, standing in the hallway outside the quarantine ward with a cup of terrible coffee and a printout of the preliminary lab results, trying to make sense of them. It's targeted, the lead physician said. He was a human, a small tired man named Doctor. Paez, who'd been working refugee medicine for a decade, and had the eyes of someone who'd seen enough suffering to have developed a specific, personal relationship with it. Completely inert in human biology. In Tanktonese physiology, it attacks the respiratory system, produces inflammatory cascades that, look, the short version is that if we don't get ahead of it, we're looking at a 60% fatality rate. Maybe higher in pediatric cases. How did it get into the water supply? Someone put it there. Halstead stared at him. This isn't natural, he said flatly. The molecular architecture is synthetic. Someone built this, and it is specifically, precisely, surgically designed to do exactly what it's doing. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I've been in refugee medicine for 10 years. I have never seen anything like this. Halstead stepped into the hallway and called Solon. He answered on the first ring. He'd been awake. Of course he'd been awake. It's a bioweapon, she said, engineered, Tanktonese specific. A long silence on his end. Then, that would require knowledge of Tanktonese biochemistry that no human organization currently possesses. I know. Which means it came from the ship. I know. She could hear him breathing. The overseer didn't come here to find us and bring us back, Mara. He came here to determine whether we were worth collecting, or whether it would be simpler to. Don't, she said. I'm just completing the logic. Don't complete the logic right now. Right now we find him. Heston Cray was in the kitchen of the Francisco house when Saria started having trouble breathing. He watched it happen from the doorway. She was at the counter trying to make tea, and her hands started shaking, and she put them flat on the countertop and breathed slowly and deliberately the way you breathe when you're trying to keep your body from doing something it's determined to do. Emma came down the stairs and stopped when she saw her mother's face, and her own face did a complicated thing. The fear arriving first, then the determination to be useful, then the careful architecture of calm she built over the fear so her mother wouldn't see it. She was 14 years old, and she was deliberately managing her own terror so her mother could focus on breathing. He had authorized the deployment of the pathogen on theoretical grounds. The calculus had seemed straightforward in the abstract. A scouting mission to assess viability of recovery versus termination, a determination to be made based on observed conditions, a field decision well within his operational authority. The Tanctonese population on this planet was a labor asset. Assets were either recoverable or written off. He'd been doing this kind of accounting for 23 years. He stood in the doorway and watched Emma take her mother's hands in both of hers, and he felt something in the clean machinery of his reasoning develop what could only be described as a fault. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. "Sit down," he said to Saria. His voice came out differently than he expected, less like an order, more like a request. "Both of you sit down." He knew the molecular structure of the pathogen because he had approved its synthesis. He knew its progression because he had reviewed the technical documentation. He also knew, because he had been thorough, because he was always thorough, that there was a counteragent. He had brought it to Earth as a contingency. The contingency had been for himself. He used it on them instead. He didn't fully understand why until he was already doing it, working through the procedure in their small kitchen with its magnet-covered refrigerator and its window box of herbs that Emma had grown herself, carefully, learning the names of each plant in English alongside their Tanctonese equivalents as a kind of personal project, as a refusal to surrender any part of herself to the pressure of becoming only one thing. He didn't understand why until Saria looked up at him mid-procedure with fever-bright eyes and said, in Tanctonese, "You're one of them, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation either. It was just an observation. From a woman running a temperature of 103, watching an overseer administer a cure to the disease he'd caused, with the same steady, unfrightened clarity she brought to everything. "Yes," he said. "Are there others sick?" "Yes." "How many?" he told her. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she said, "Then you need to make more of that." He looked at her. "You have the formula," she said. "You have the equipment on the ship. You can make more." A pause. "Unless you'd rather not." He held the injector in his hands for a long time. Then he said, "The formula requires a specific precursor compound. I would need to synthesize it on site. I would need 4 to 6 hours and a reasonably equipped laboratory." "The integration center has a laboratory," Emma said. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a glass of water, watching him with dark eyes that were already steadier than they'd been 20 minutes ago. "My mom works there." "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. Halstead had 3 cruisers at the integration center's entrance, and a federal contact on the phone when the car pulled in. A civilian sedan, moving slowly, no sudden movements. She had her hand on her weapon. Solon touched her arm. "Wait." She waited. Saria Francisco got out of the passenger side. She was visibly ill, sweat-sheened, moving carefully, but she was upright and she walked to Halstead with her head up. "The man with me can stop this," she said. "Not because he wants to do the right thing. Because," she paused, and something passed across her face. "Because he's in the process of figuring out that he does." "Where is he?" "Still in the car." "He won't run." She looked back at the sedan. "He's scared, I think. I don't know if he knows that yet." Halstead looked at Solon. Solon looked at her. "You'd better come out," Halstead said toward the car. The door opened slowly. Heston Cray, the overseer, the man who had walked into a valley full of his former slaves and had allowed himself to become, briefly, something other than what he was trained to be, stepped out into the white morning light and stood with his hands visible at his sides. He was still not sweating, but something in his face had changed. What followed was not simple, and it was not clean, and it did not resolve the way things resolve in stories where the problem has a solution and the solution ends the problem. 3 newcomers died before the counteragent could be distributed. Vest Olan was one of them. His daughter sat with him at the end, in the quarantine ward, holding his 4-fingered hand in both of hers, and Dr. Payas stood outside the room for a long time after. The overseer worked in the lab for 5 hours and 40 minutes straight without stopping. Halstead kept 2 armed officers in the room with him at all times and watched through the glass for most of it. He worked with the focused economical efficiency of someone who had been trained to accomplish objectives and had simply redirected that training at a different objective. He did not seem to feel the weight of what he'd done, or if he did, it didn't slow him down, and she decided that was probably better. Solon came to stand beside her at the observation window around the third hour. "You know him," she said. It wasn't a question. I knew of him, his type. A pause. "When I was young, on the ship, before I understood the structure of things, there was an overseer who managed our sector. He was not cruel in an obvious way. He was efficient. He made the systems work. People almost liked him in the way that prisoners almost like a warden who runs a clean facility." Solon watched the man in the lab. "I used to think that made him the worst kind. Now I'm less certain. Because he's fixing it? Because he's choosing to. That's not nothing." Halstead looked at her partner, at the spotted temples and the careful, deliberate face and the 23 years of someone else's decisions he was still walking around with inside him. "No," she said. "It's not nothing." She looked back at the lab where a man who had come to this planet to decide the fate of 230,000 people was bent over a synthesis array, working, his hands moving with precise and focused purpose, his face holding something she had no frame of reference for and had no name for yet, but which she thought, if she had to guess, might be the beginning of understanding what it cost to stop being what you were built to be. The counteragent worked. Not instantly. Nothing in medicine works instantly, despite what people expect. But by the second day, the mortality rate in the infected population had dropped to near zero, and by the third day, the integration center's quarantine ward was discharging patients, and by the end of the week, the valley smelled like dry grass and irrigation water, and the particular sweetness of August stone fruit, and nothing that had happened felt entirely real yet, the way trauma doesn't, until suddenly it does. Halstead filed her report on day 4. It was 63 pages, and she was not satisfied with any of it, because there was no framework in the existing legal or procedural structure that adequately addressed what had happened. Not the bioweapon deployment, not the overseer's cooperation, not the 3 deaths, not the larger question of what it meant that a vessel of that size was somewhere in the outer system waiting for a signal about the disposition of its cargo. She left that last part for the federal analysts to argue about. It was above her pay grade in at least 4 different ways. What she did on day 5 was drive out to the integration center and sit in the waiting room for an hour until Saria Francisco came out of her shift. She was moving normally now, the fever gone, the particular alertness of a body recently returned to itself still visible in the brightness of her eyes. They sat in the parking lot in Halstead's car with the windows down. "Where is he now?" Saria asked. "Custody, federal holding. They haven't decided what to do with him yet. He saved 200 lives. He also deployed the weapon that threatened those 200 lives. I know." Saria turned the window crank. The car was old enough to have window cranks, back and forth slightly without rolling it further. "He told me something while he was working. He said he'd never been inside a house before. An actual house, with people living in it. He'd managed populations for 23 years, and he'd never been inside the space where they actually lived." Halstead considered that. "You feel sorry for him," she said. "I feel something," Saria said. "I'm not sure it's sorry. I've had a lot of practice not knowing exactly what to feel." She looked out at the valley, the brown hills in the distance going gold in the afternoon light. "He sat at my kitchen table. He ate the same food we ate. He watched my daughter teach him a word in English, and he repeated it back wrong on purpose to make her laugh." A long pause. "People are not what they're built to be. Not only that, sometimes they are, sometimes," she agreed. "But sometimes they choose something else." Halstead drove home that night on the long road through the valley, past the temporary housing blocks with their hand-painted signs, and the integration center parking lot, still half full at 7 in the evening, and the roadside stalls where newcomers sold produce alongside their human neighbors, the strange doubled nature of it, the two species going about the business of coexistence with the grim and stubborn pragmatism that turned out to be the most reliable engine of civilization there was. She thought about the overseer in his federal holding cell. She thought about 3 people who were dead and 200 who weren't. She thought about a 14-year-old girl who grew herbs on a windowsill and learned their names in 2 languages because she had decided, instinctively, and without anyone having to tell her, that being 2 things was better than being 1. She thought about what Solon had said, that choosing is not nothing. What came next, what was always going to come next, because the vessel in the outer system was not going to receive a signal and simply accept the silence, came 3 weeks later, On a clear Tuesday morning, when NORAD began tracking an approach vector that didn't match any registered spacecraft in the near-Earth catalog, it was big. Not the kind of big that registered as a number first. The kind of big that registered as a wrongness in the visual field, as the sky doing something the sky was not supposed to do. People in the valley looked up and stopped whatever they were doing. Dogs went quiet. Children pointed. In the federal holding facility, a man who had called himself Heston Cray sat in his cell and listened to the sound of running feet in the corridors outside and felt the particular quality of the silence that followed, the held breath quality, and knew exactly what it meant. He asked to speak to Halstead. She came in 40 minutes, still buttoning her jacket, moving fast. "How many are on that ship?" she said. He told her the crew complement. He told her the weapons loadout, the approach protocols, the communication frequencies, and their Tenctonese designations, the command structure, and the chain of authorization. He told her everything, with the flat, unhurried precision of a man who had been an instrument of a system for 23 years and was choosing, deliberately, and with full understanding of what it cost, to stop. She was typing as fast as he could talk. At one point, she stopped and looked up at him. "Why?" she said. He thought about Saria Francisco putting food in front of him without asking. He thought about Emma growing herbs on a windowsill in 2 languages. He thought about the kitchen table and the open windows and the neighbors who came over for no reason except that they wanted to be there, and the way that wanting, that ordinary, uncalculated wanting, had looked to him from the outside, like something he had no instruments to measure. "I have been making assessments of populations for 23 years, he said. "This is the first one where I concluded they were worth keeping." Halstead looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to work. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a negotiation conducted under extreme duress at extremely close range, with Halstead coordinating between the Federal Response Team, the NORAD tracking units, 2 UN emergency sessions conducted via video link in real time, and a Tenctonese community liaison team that Solon had assembled from the Integration Center in about 45 minutes, which was roughly how long they had before the approaching vessel reached geosynchronous orbit. The overseer's intelligence was the margin, not just the technical data, though the technical data mattered, the frequencies and protocols and the deadman failsafes he knew about that the approaching crew would not expect to have compromised. What mattered more was the thing he understood about the system he'd served for 23 years, that it was built on the assumption of compliance. It had no protocols for dealing with an asset that had chosen to become something other than an asset. Halstead used that. She built the transmission with Solon's help, Solon translating, Solon inflecting, Solon putting into the formal register of command-level Tenctonese the precise legal and operational argument that the mission had been compromised, that the scout had been turned, that proceeding to recovery operations without new intelligence would violate standing protocols for contaminated assets. She built it cold and procedural because that was the language it needed to be in, and she sent it on the frequencies the overseer had given her, and she sat in the monitoring room and waited. The vessel decelerated. It didn't leave. That would have been too simple, and nothing about any of this was simple. But it held position, and it opened a response channel. And what began then was a 3-day diplomatic crisis that involved parties and agencies and jurisdictions that had never had to work together before. And that produced, eventually, a framework agreement that was inadequate in roughly 30 different ways, and was still, by a significant margin, better than any alternative that had been on the table. Halstead slept 4 hours in 3 days. Solon didn't sleep at all, or if he did, she didn't see it. On the second day, during a 90-minute recess in the negotiations, she found him in the break room of the command center, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "Are you all right?" she said. "I'm thinking about a word," he said. "What word?" "There's a word in Tenctonese. There isn't a precise English equivalent. It describes the state of having been a thing you didn't choose and becoming something different. Not recovering. Not going back to what you were before. Becoming something that couldn't have existed without the experience of the first thing, but is not defined by it." He turned the cold cup in his hands. "I've been trying to figure out if there's an English word for it." Halstead thought about it. "Maybe there isn't one yet," she said. "Maybe not." He picked up the cold coffee and drank it. "Perhaps we need to make one." The vessel withdrew on the 4th day, not permanently. Everyone understood that. The agreement was provisional. The framework had enforcement gaps the size of stadiums, and there were factions aboard the ship that had voted against the withdrawal and would continue to vote against it, and the outer system was not a boundary that anyone had the capacity to patrol. The situation was unresolved. It would remain unresolved for a long time. Anyone who told you otherwise was selling something, but the vessel withdrew. Halstead stood outside the command center in the early morning of the fourth day and watched the sky not doing anything it wasn't supposed to, and thought about resolution versus progress, and decided that progress was probably enough. Not sufficient, never sufficient, not yet, but enough to keep working with. Solon came out and stood beside her. "What happens to him?" she asked. She didn't need to specify who. "I don't know. I assume it will be decided by people with more authority than us."
What do you think should happen?
He was quiet for a moment. "I think he should be given a very long time to sit with what he is and what he chose and what those two things cost." A pause. "And then perhaps something useful to do with it." Halstead nodded. The valley spread out below them in the early light. The housing blocks and the irrigation channels and the integration center with its morning shift coming in. The people arriving at the gates, human and Tenctonese both, with their ID lanyards and their coffee cups and the ordinary determination of people who had decided to be here, doing this work on this particular morning for no reason that could be reduced to calculation. "There's a word in English," she said. "Might be the one you're looking for. What is it?" "Becoming." She looked at him. "It doesn't have a clean ending. That's kind of the point." Solon looked at the valley for a long time. "That might be it," he said. "Somewhere on the second floor of the integration center, in a room with a window that got afternoon shade, a 14-year-old girl with a spotted brow and 2 languages and a small box of herbs she'd grown herself was sleeping through her alarm. Her mother would come to the door in a few minutes and knock twice and tell her she was going to be late. The girl would say 1 more minute with the perfect confidence of someone who had never been given a reason to be afraid of that. The sky above the valley was clear and ordinary and full of nothing alarming. For now, that was enough.